Hi, everyone. My name is Gala Presby-Nathan. I'm the director of the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I'm pleased to share with you in this video the three winners of a new annual prize that is offered by the Sophie Davis Forum on Gender, Conflict, and Peace, which operates within the Institute. The prize is awarded to outstanding research conducted at the Hebrew University dealing with gender and conflict, or gender and transitions to peace, or gender and international relations more broadly. This year, we have chosen to award the prize to three excellent papers. The first winning paper is by Dr. Veronica Leon, a postdoctoral fellow at the Sophie Davis Forum. Her paper, Peace Can Only Come Wrapped in an Israeli Flag, Navigating Multiple Frames in an Intersectional Women's Peace Movement, was published in the journal Mobilization, an international quarterly, in its volume 30, 2025. The article, based on her PhD work, focuses on the challenges of balancing multiple frames in the context of women's activism. Veronica uses the case study of the Israeli women-led peace movement, Women Wage Peace, and through semi-structured interviews within an ethnographic approach, she explores the challenges of aligning two frames of peace and of intersectionality within one movement's framing strategy. The second winning paper is by Dr. Ambreen Ben-Shmuel. Her paper, Gender, Environment, and Peace, Institutional Frameworks and Organizational Practices in Israeli-Palestinian Cooperation, is drawn also from her dissertation project and represents 4 years of intensive ethnographic fieldwork with an environmental peace-building organization operating across Israeli and Palestinian communities. It demonstrates how differing levels of gender institutionalization in peace-building and in the environmental fields create distinct organizational practices, ultimately influencing the effectiveness both of sustainability and peace initiatives in conflict settings. Finally, the third winning paper is by Ms. Ronnie Berkowitz and Mr. Uri Kidron, who are graduate students at the Davis Graduate School of International Relations and the International Relations Department at Hebrew University. Their paper is entitled How States Talk Rape, National Discourse on Wartime Sexual Violence in the Digital Age. In the paper, using feminist international relations theory and strategic narrative theory, the paper explores how states strategically construct narratives surrounding conflict-related sexual violence in the digital age. They focus on the 2022 full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. All three papers represent original, interesting, thorough, and thought-provoking research, and we invite you all to listen to the brief presentations that follow this quick introduction. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Veronica Leon, and I'm honored to receive the Sophie Davis Award from the Davis Institute for International Relations from a recently published article, which I'm happy to present today. I would like to begin with a quote that gave the paper its title. Words that were spoken to me in an interview with Shir Levinas, one of the founding members of Women Wage Peace and a noted scholar and practitioner in conflict resolution. She said, "Peace can only come wrapped in the Israeli flag. It cannot come with those that hate the Israeli flag, that are against the flag, that don't feel comfortable with it." This quote encapsulates the central tension I examined in this study. The challenge of sustaining a broad-based intersectional peace movement in a context where nationalism, ethnicity, and class are not just background dynamics, but actively shape the terms of belonging and legitimacy. My research focuses on Women Wage Peace, the largest women-led peace movement in the region, with over 45,000 registered members. Founded in 2014 during yet another war with Gaza, Women Wage Peace positions itself as inclusive and nonpartisan and builds on the experiences and practices of previous women's peace activism in Israel and globally. This case is part of a broader inquiry into how social movements navigate internal contradictions when trying to integrate intersectional inclusion into dominant frames of collective actions. It asks, what happens when social movements attempt to align the frame of peace with an intersectional frame of inclusion? What frictions emerge, and what are the consequences for movements' internal coherence, political resonance, and transformative potential? What I found is that Women Wage Peace's initial commitment to diversity and inclusion generated new possibilities, but also internal friction. Over time, this friction led to a retreat from intersectional framing and a return to more familiar tropes of maternal peace activism. This question feels especially urgent in light of the ongoing war in Gaza and the conference's theme of women redefining security, in which context I was supposed to present this research. As violence continues to reshape the political landscape, feminist and women-led movements must confront what security means for whom and on whose terms. To understand how Women Wage Peace emerged and why its framing strategy matters, one needs to consider the broader political and discursive landscape in Israel over the past decades. Since the failure of the Oslo Accords and the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the concept of peace has become increasingly marginalized in Israeli public life. Once a defining theme of political discourse, peace is now largely absent, even a taboo in mainstream conversation. This disappearance reflects not only a linguistic shift, but a deep disillusionment with formal negotiations, a rightward shift in the electorate, and the fragmentation of the traditional Zionist left. In this context, peace has come to be seen not as a pragmatic goal, but as a naive and even dangerous fantasy, often associated with political defeat or betrayal. It is into this vacuum that Women Wage Peace stepped in 2014 during yet another war with Gaza. What made Women Wage Peace distinctive was not only its gendered identity as a women-led movement, but its framing of peace as something broad, pragmatic, and inclusive. Rather than aligning with the traditional peace camp, Women Wage Peace sought to create a new discursive space, one that could reach women across political, ethnic, religious, and geographic lines. But this attempt to expand the constituency for peace, to speak in a language that resonated both with urban liberals and women from conservative, peripheral, or right-wing backgrounds, posed serious challenges. And it is here that the movement's decision to incorporate intersectionality became both groundbreaking and precarious. Intersectionality, as I use it in this research, refers not only to a focus on identity categories such as gender, ethnicity, and class, but also to the practices and politics of inclusion. It is about recognizing how systems of power intersect in people's lived experiences and how that shapes their visions of peace. To answer these questions, I used a feminist ethnographic approach, grounded in both empathy and critical distance. The core dataset includes 41 semi-structured interviews with current and former Women Wage Peace members, conducted between 2020 and 2021, with women from diverse ethnic, political, religious, and geographic backgrounds. My sample reflected the internal diversity and tensions within the movement. Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, and Palestinian Israeli women, secular and religious, urban and peripheral, liberal and right-wing. In addition to interviews, I drew on participant observation and digital ethnography of Women Wage Peace's public activities and online presence from 2018 to 2021. One of the clearest findings of this research is that inclusion is not the same as equity. While Women Wage Peace's discourse emphasized broad representation, its internal practices often reproduced existing hierarchies, particularly along ethnic and class lines. Mizrahi members, for example, repeatedly described feeling marginalized, especially when their nationalist or conservative interpretations of peace clashed with dominant liberal Zionist norms within the movement. Zohar, a Mizrahi woman from a southern developmental town, captured this frustration poignantly. I'm not the priority of Women Wage Peace. I am at the most bottom part of Women Wage Peace, because if I and an Arab woman say something, first they will listen to her, and then they will listen to me. This sense of preferential solidarity, in which Palestinian Israeli voices were consistently prioritized over Mizrahi ones, reflected deeper power asymmetries, not only within the movement, but in the broader peace discourse in Israel. Research has long shown that Israel's peace camp lacks ethnic, geographic, and class diversity. Another participant recounted a public event where a Palestinian speaker condemned the Israeli military practices. She had invited right-wing women from her town who were alienated by the speech and never returned. She said, "They told me I betrayed them. They only came because they trusted me. But I didn't even understand what he was saying. He only spoke in English." Such moments reveal how language, class, and social geography intersect to define who feels at home in the movement and who does not. These dynamics complicated efforts to create a shared vision of peace and expose the limitations of Women Wage Peace's inclusive frame. These internal tensions also reshaped the movement's strategic priorities. While Women Wage Peace initially emphasized internal diversification, particularly among Jewish constituencies, its focus gradually shifted towards cross-border initiatives and maternal framing. This pivot reflected a pragmatic recalibration, privileging external visibility over the internal work of negotiating difference. Batya, one of Women Wage Peace's national organizers, explained to me, "Our goal is within a year to get representatives to the negotiation table, so projects that don't support this goal will have to wait." This narrowing of strategic focus coincided with the rise of symbolic initiatives like the Mother's Call, a joint petition with Palestinian activists from Women of the Sun. While publicly compelling, this maternal nationalist framing marginalized efforts to build an inclusive discourse within Israeli society itself. Hamutal, a Mizrahi participant from a southern developmental town, expressed frustration with symbolic exclusions. "They didn't even want us to use the Israeli flag. There were almost no flags in the movement. Even the anthem we barely played." Her account stands in contrast to the inclusive Zionist framing invoked by Shira Levinas that I shared earlier. Meanwhile, Lara, a Druze participant from the north, articulated a broader vision. Peace is not just military security, it's also personal security and economic security. It's missing, and if we come and broaden the meaning of personal security, maybe it will help, not just to talk about political peace, but also about internal peace. Zohar, whom I mentioned earlier, echoed this by saying, "The language of women rich peace is not the Israeli language of the peripheries, and as long as there isn't a language that will unite us, we won't be able to advance." These perspectives underscore the fragmentation of meanings attached to peace and security, revealing how women wage peace's move toward national consensus came at the expense of pluralism and internal transformation. These findings contribute to the literature on social movements and intersectionality by illustrating the tensions that emerge when movements attempt to align competing frames, such as peace and inclusion. As others have argued, intersectionality cannot simply be added onto dominant repertoires. It requires a deeper reconfiguration of leadership cultures and discursive norms. In the case of Women Wage Peace, the retreat from intersectional framing was not due to its irrelevance, but rather its disruptive potential, its challenge to internal power relations, and the dominant imaginaries of peace and security. This case thus underscores a broader dilemma facing feminist and peace movements: how to sustain political resonance while confronting the structural hierarchies that shape participation. Rather than viewing intersectionality as a static framework, the study highlights its dynamic, contested, and often fragile position within collective action. Returning to Shira Levinas's observation that peace can only come wrapped in the Israeli flag, we see how Women Wage Peace's pursuit of broad resonance entailed adopting culturally legible and nationally recognizable symbols. While this expanded the movement's public legitimacy, it also circumscribed its capacity for internal transformation. Rather than challenging dominant assumptions about peace and security, the movement's strategic realignment reinforced prevailing hierarchies of gender, ethnicity, and political belonging. Women Wage Peace initially aimed to diversify the peace discourse by incorporating multiple perspectives, but its retreat into cross-national maternal framing ultimately constrained its ability to sustain a genuinely intersectional approach within Israeli society. The case of Women Wage Peace thus reflects a broader dilemma confronting feminist and peace movements operating in conflictual and polarized societies and contexts. Can movements maintain transformative ambition while seeking mainstream appeal, or does inclusion risk being neutralized by dominant frames? If intersectionality is to function not only as an analytical tool, but as a political commitment, then peace must be imagined from a plurality of lived realities, even when those realities challenge one another. Only through such confrontation can movements begin to disrupt the intersecting structures that sustain both direct and structural violence. Thank you very much, both for the award and for listening.
Thank you for the opportunity to present this work. The empirical context that grounds this research is marked by protracted conflict and profound power asymmetries. As a peace activist and researcher examining environmental and peace-building initiatives in the Israeli and Palestinian region, I'm acutely aware of the political sensitivities surrounding this work. The violence and destruction of the past 2 years has cast a harsh light on the urgency of addressing the intersecting grand challenges of conflict resolution and sustainability. Yet, despite immense adversity, the partners involved in this study, Israelis and Palestinians alike, remain steadfast in their shared commitment to improving political and environmental conditions and are still working together, even today. As organizational researchers increasingly focus their attention on addressing ecological crises and peace, and recognize the role of organizations in addressing these grand challenges, the gendered nature of these challenges or the organizational responses to them has been understudied. With that short introduction, I'd like to take you back to a few days of my fieldwork in the fall of 2021. During my research, I joined a group of Gazan engineers and community development members on a short course involving sustainable infrastructure. They were to visit parts of Israel and the West Bank and see various off-grid, low-tech to high-tech environmental interventions to address issues around water, renewable energy, and agriculture. Their visit was jointly coordinated by Israeli and Palestinian partner organizations engaged in transboundary environmental cooperation. There were nearly an equal number of men and women who were recruited, and this gender balance was largely intact, even after the Israeli civil administration only issued permits to select members. As the group prepared to leave Gaza, officials delayed them for 6 hours, arguing with the partners about the women's participation in the trip. The Palestinian men were engineers in respected organizations who the officials thought could benefit from exposure to the high-tech interventions and trainings that would occur, while the women were largely affiliated with their town or neighborhood's local environmental or women's club. The officials wanted to let the men go, but not the women. The partners who were there later explained to me that they insisted that the Gazan officials allow all of them to come or none of them, saying that if they would not let the women participate, the men would not benefit either, as they would cancel the program. When I asked them why, they said it's important to have women here, and we've been trying to include women. Eventually, the women were permitted to join. During the trip, we traveled throughout Israel and Palestine, yet as time went on, it became clear that while there was a mixture of high-tech and low-tech interventions that the group was exposed to, there was a clear hierarchy, both to the technology and to the participants. All of the exposure to the low-tech solutions were hurried along, shortened, and some sites were even canceled entirely, while there was a preference by the partners to expose the group to the high-tech interventions. The men in particular were most interested in this, which could be implemented on a much larger scale, while the women were much more interested in the lower tech and off-grid interventions. This short story captures some of the gender regimes at play within organizations addressing grand challenges. Unpacking this, and particularly zooming in on the main organization's peace and environmental work, became a central focus of my study. At the theoretical level, my research explores how organizational gender regimes, shaped by field-specific dynamics, impact organizations' ability to address grand challenges. To explore this, I draw on 3 theoretical perspectives. First, grand challenges are pervasive, cross-cutting social problems that demand cooperation across organizations and sectors. However, there's little and only emerging discussion of how grand challenges are deeply gendered, with masculine logics and interests often shaping priorities, strategies, and interventions. Relative to the previous literature, researchers have better addressed how institutions and fields are gendered spaces that reflect and reproduce inequalities. In my work, I focus on issue fields, which are the relational spaces where diverse actors interact to address contested social issues or problems. I also look at gender regimes, which is the patterning of gender relations at a broader field level. The gendered nature of issue fields can shape the dynamics of organizations operating within them. Importantly, organizations operating across multiple issue fields, like peace or the environment, may face competing institutional logics and pressures, which consequently shape their gender regimes in domain-specific ways. Finally, Acker argues that gendered organizations perpetuate advantage and disadvantage through a number of processes, and these processes form inequality regimes that, in the absence of intervention, maintain gender disparities. Integrating Acker's framework with field theory, I examine how organizational gender regimes are shaped by the gender dynamics of the fields in which they operate. By combining these theoretical perspectives, I'm trying to develop a framework that attends to the multi-level interplay between field-level gender regimes manifested in organizational and inequality regimes and organizations' ability to address grand challenges in gender-inclusive ways across fields. To briefly address the research context, which allows me to explore multiple gender and field level dynamics in one case, I focus on an environmental peacebuilding organization. Environmental peacebuilding has been defined as all forms of cooperation between social groups on environmental issues that aim to minimize violent conflict and increase more peaceful relations. Since the 1990s, there's been a precedent for cross-border environmental cooperation in the Israel-Palestine and Jordan context due to the Oslo peace process and the Israel-Jordan peace agreement. CTEC, the organization at the heart of this study, conducts its work in this context. Within the organization, at an emic level, people made a distinction between work that was more peace-related or more environment-related, and this tended to be divided into respective organizational departments. Through several years of ethnographic fieldwork in a single organization, including over 25 months of weekly observations, 80 interviews, and extensive archival data, I found stark differences in their relation to gender and gender inclusion across the two issue fields. I found contrasting gender regimes in the two domains, while efforts to blend approaches faced significant challenges. So first, supportive institutional frameworks in the peacebuilding domain contributed to more gender-integrated perspectives and engagement in this part of the organization's work. And I won't go into this deeply, but members referenced external influences like donor demands for gender inclusion that contributed to their work, which is linked to the institutionalization of gender in the field since UN Resolution 1325 called for the integration of women and girls into peace and conflict resolution. And this points to aspects of an inclusive gender regime at a field level with attentiveness to gender relations of power and gender divisions, namely in recruitment. The organization also noted the various ways that they sought to incorporate gender inclusion, which positively corresponds to Connell's gender regimes as being more gender inclusive. In the environmental issue field, I found that a lack of gender mainstreaming perpetuated technocratic, gender-blind practices. And here, starting at the meso level, I found that teams were predominantly led by men, decision-making often centered on technical expertise, with gender rarely explicitly addressed. And as several members noted, gender isn't relevant. What do women have to do with it? We don't see gender, and water is for everyone. And in alignment with what we often see in other contexts, gender-neutral approaches often result in gender marginalization. There was a focus on professional competence and technical skills within a fixed, narrow understanding of what this could look like. And when it came to gender culture and symbolism, this approach was largely outcome-focused, with a preference for concrete outputs within a very narrow time frame. To go back to the opening story, in the months that followed, despite discussing projects for women, none of the projects preferred by Gazan women were implemented compared to the approximately dozen projects implemented of interest to men and senior, mostly male leaders. At macro level, when inquiring about how external factors influence this, people reported that donors were happy to overlook gender in environmental projects, preferencing speed, tangibility, and technology. And we begin to see the internal logic here with its own hierarchy and preferences. And this finding highlights how the absence of institutional frameworks for gender mainstreaming, as seen in the environmental field, can perpetuate gender-blind approaches. Excuse me. It demonstrates how gender-exclusive field dynamics can constrain organizations' ability to address grand challenges, reflecting not only Connell's gender regimes, but Acker's concept of inequality regimes. And this table is basically highlighting how gender dynamics can vary within a single organization, shaped by the logics of different issue fields. I'll only briefly mention some of the dynamics here where there were some mid-level managers in the organizations, these intrapreneurs who are attempting to adopt ideas from the more gender-inclusive logic of the peace domain into their work in the environmental domain. And they had some success, but without the support of more senior figures and external mainstreaming, this only could go so far. This paper offers a number of contributions and for grand challenges, hopefully provides insights into how gender dynamics may influence organizational approaches to these challenges like peace or the environment, and open avenues for further research on the relationship between gender regimes and organizational responses to complex societal issues. Finally, to the empirical field itself, the study identifies ongoing gender inequality, pointing to areas where interventions and a gender-sensitive approach can make a meaningful difference. For example, by ensuring that projects currently being developed for implementation in Gaza as soon as there's a ceasefire will engage with women as equal stakeholders in environmental interventions. Sustainable solutions to complex problems demand the integration of diverse perspectives, experiences, and approaches. Grappling with gender is one of them. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ricky Dron, and I'm honored to receive the Sophie Davis Award from the Davis Institute for International Relations for the research How States Talk Rape by Ronnie Berkowitz and myself. This research, interestingly enough, is a byproduct of a course taken in the relation to the Sophie Davis Forum, a course by Professor Andrea Petto discussing sexual violence during wartime. When Ronnie and I took this course a number of years ago, we started to discuss the issue of rape as a weapon of war and in general, how the issue of sexual related violence is affected by social media, mass media, and global communications in general, which essentially brought us to this project. This project was also presented in a conference by the Israel Association for International Relations and in the ISA conference in Montreal as well. So from a theory standpoint, as I've said, we came to it from the interest in the issue of rape as a weapon of war. And essentially, we came to the question of how do states strategically construct and deploy CRSV narratives in digital communication to achieve conflict-related objectives, essentially being interested in how states talk about sexual-related violence. Our analytical framework as a later stage essentially constructed two different categories. One of them is strategic silencing, and the second one is strategic talk. In each time, in one case, the country or state tries to suppress reports of CRSV, and in the other case, it tries to amplify them. And we saw different narrative types connected to each one of those categories. Here we can see the 6 narrative types down here. And when we came to our specific case study of the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we went through the data and categorized it by those categories that we just saw right now. So in both cases, we looked at state communications. We looked specifically at government-owned media outlets and government-related media outlets. And we also looked at officials in the government in both cases, in the Russian case and in the Ukrainian case, on Twitter and in Telegram. And we analyzed what they said about sexual violence during those 3 months that we looked at from the beginning of the war and coded them based on the categories that we just saw. And what we can see from those categorizations, we can see some interesting things. First of all, we see that in Ukraine, following the Bucha reports, after the Russian soldiers are leaving the Ukrainian outskirts of Kiev, we're starting to see a significant rise in how much is CRSV becoming a topic in the Ukrainian media and in the Ukrainian government. But in the Russian case, we can see, again, we can also see this rise, but we also see that it was a discussion before. And we suspect that this might be a result of the Russian attempts to justify the war in Ukraine based on what was happening in the Donbas area before that as a justification for Russian actions. Another thing that we can see when we look at those different categories on both sides, in red colors here you can see strategic talk, and the other colors represent strategic silencing. So we can see that Ukraine does much more strategic talk in comparison to what Russia does, which is focused much more on strategic silencing when we compare the two of them. But both of them talk much more than they silence. We can see also something interesting that when we're looking at the Ukrainian side, the main category is creating moral leverage and recruiting support, with strengthening nationalism and justifying war as a second but distant one in how much they talk about it in discussing sexual related violence. But when we're looking at the Russian side, we can see that it's much more even between strengthening nationalism and justifying war, creating moral leverage and recruiting support, and also protecting national image and avoiding accountability. To a degree, we might think that it was something that was a little bit expected, that the Ukrainians will deal more with creating moral leverage and recruiting support, being the weaker side in the conflict, and also the fact that the Russians are focused more on protecting national image following the reports of Russian actions in Bucha. Again, this might explain that. Another interesting finding that we saw is that Russia, when it speaks in Russian, it is focused much more on denying CRSV accusations. But when it speaks in English, it's much more interesting in attempting to justify the war to begin with. So we can also see this linguistical difference right here. So we saw in both cases, and you saw before the different categories about that both sides can use CRSV as a strategic tool, trying to promote military goals, diplomatic goals, or public relation goals. So this is evident in both cases. Again, each case for different goals. And not only that, we can also see, and this is one of the implications perhaps of this research, different ethical risks when looking at discussions of sexual related violence, when it is orchestrated, the discussion is orchestrated by the state itself. And there is a fear that under certain circumstances, the state interests might overpower a more victim-centered approach, focused more on the experience of the victims and the survivors themselves in relation to state goals in the military conflict. So again, I would like just to thank the Davis Institute for International Relations from Ronnie and myself. And again, thank you very much. And this was our research.